Okay, I've come here to talk to you about the tragedy of the Kronstadt. And so, of course, this is the task of discussing the Kronstadt Rebellion. However, I need to make 3 theoretical detours and a few historical ones to do it justice. First, that I assert you cannot give a history free of bias. However, one should remain as honest as one can possibly be about that bias and make it clear. I am a Marxist-Leninist. I side with the Bolsheviks at the Kronstadt. You should remember this, and of course, I will try and give as accurate and an objective of history as possible, but this will necessarily be a bias that colors my history of it. And again, I do not believe, as a matter of fact, I can give the historical situation and reasoning for them, the Bolsheviks, and reason them out, without, as a matter of fact, justifying them. So there's that. However, I will try to mark these ambiguous places as best I can. And next, I also think that it's important to make the old Stalinist distinction between subjective intentions and objective effects. Generally speaking, all but the most dogmatic Bolshevik supporters or anarchists assert that the other side had subjective ill intentions, right? For the anarchists, they see the Bolsheviks as overly paranoid about the counter-revolution, and in being so, betray the revolution itself through state domination. For the Bolsheviks, they see the anarchists, generally speaking, as naive about the dangers facing the socialist republic and willing to take actions to undermine the efforts of the struggle against counter-revolution. I will try and disentangle, as best I can, these two tensions. And finally, I believe that tragedy is an important concept for understanding the formation of the Soviet Union. Paraphrasing Aristotle just a bit, tragedy is an imitation of an action that is admirable, complete, and possessing magnitude, but through some hamartia, that is to say a flaw or mistake, the hero comes to a painful reversal of fortunes. The Soviet areas and the Kronstadt sailors certainly fit this description. I shall also make a few historical detours to give the proper context to the Kronstadt uprising. To properly understand the meaning of the Kronstadt uprising, we need to go through the revolutionary history of the Kronstadt and the role of its sailors in both both in its revolutionary history, including the February and October revolutions. Next, we also need to understand the broad strokes of the Russian Civil War and the repressive measures taken by the Bolsheviks, known collectively as war communism. And of course, the anarchist, peasant, and worker reaction to many of these policies. From this place only can one understand the real contours of the Kronstadt rebellion. The Kronstadt soldiers had a long history of revolutionary tradition. They had rebelled against the Tsar in the 1905 revolution, and the heroic symbol of the battleship Potemkin, with its uprising and escape, further radicalized the Navy. The Kronstadt soldiers joined the Petrograd workers and killed and imprisoned their officers after they were threatened to be disciplined for not eating rotten meat. This combination of workers, soldiers, sailors, and rioters ensured the success of the Petrograd uprising and brought about the February Revolution and the abdication of the Tsar, Tsar Nicholas II. The new provisional government, made up of both liberal and socialist parties, continued to support the war against Germany, leading to widespread anger. This, of course, being during World War I. The Bolsheviks under Lenin denounced the war and attempted to organize the riots about the war into a resistance to the provisional government proper. The provisional government suppressed the Bolsheviks and they fled underground. This was, again, known as the July Days. However, the provisional government asked for the Bolshevik support when General Kornilov attempted to lead a rebellion against the government and essentially restore a more monarchical or repressive system. So, at this period, the Bolsheviks had increasing support, and when they called again for the seizure of the government in October, in the October Revolution, the Kronstadt soldiers, or rather sailors, responded. They backed the Bolshevik the Bolsheviks and the seizure of power, and many of the Kronstadt sailors became the backbone for the Red Guards, who would later be reorganized as the Red Army. However, the victories of the October Revolution were short-lived. Enemies, both internal and external, besieged the young Bolshevik state. The Mensheviks and those social revolutionaries, which is a party, who did not support the overthrow of the provisional government, refused to participate in the new state and denounced the Bolsheviks constantly. Meanwhile, the White Russians attempted to regroup their forces to topple the fragile government, and foreign powers such as England, France, the United States, and Japan plunged into the fledgling republic to secure their own imperialist interests. All the while, anarchists and nationalists in the Ukraine and elsewhere prevented the flow of grain to starving Bolshevik cities. Lenin and the Bolshevik leadership believed that extraordinary measures were needed. The Bolsheviks instituted a set of repressive measures known as war communism. They allowed for the redistribution of feudal land to peasants, which the peasants loved. However, the provisions to nationalize all resources, farms, factories, and railroads and institute a rigid military control over numerous sectors of the economy and also entailed a strong restriction on trade was less loved. They also institutionalized conscription for the Red Army, whereas previously the Red Guards were made up of only volunteers. The Bolsheviks granted the most controversy, the Bolsheviks generated the most controversy over the introduction of the Prodvrestroika, which basically is that the Bolsheviks requisitioned any surplus grain or bread that the peasants had above household needs in order to feed the starving cities and the newly forming army. Needless to say, they met with fierce resistance. Repression occurred swiftly against demonstrators and strikers in cities, but the true struggle occurred between the Bolsheviks and the peasants. The peasants initially supported the Bolshevik decree dissolving private ownership of all land, which the peasants used then to justify individual land seizures for farming. However, support turned to rage once the Bolsheviks organized enough to begin enforcing the nationalization of land through requisitioning. Peasants' uprising ran from the simple riot to the organized military resistance exemplified by Nestor Makhno's Black Anarchist Army. Intense fighting flared up all across the country, and the devastation created through the Bolshevik war communism horrified many of the soldiers and sailors who returned home, who as peasants, they began to question the intents of the Bolshevik leadership. However, slowly but surely, the Bolshevik enemies vanished. The Bolsheviks had taken a position of absolute weakness and turned it into victory. The Bolsheviks stabilized their lines and began to push back against the white forces. Kornilov, who led the attempted seizure of the provisional government, died by a Bolshevik shell in April the 18th. A combination of Bolshevik and Makhnovist forces drove the white General Dekinin south and out of the effective theater of battle of the Soviet Union. They also executed the white General Kolchak and forced Peter Nikolaevich Wrangel to flee through the south. In the winter of 1920, the Bolsheviks demanded that Makhno disband his Black Anarchist Army and drove him out of the Ukraine when he refused. By 1920, the Red Resistance had caused the French, English, American, and other Allied countries to withdraw, with the notable exception of Japan, who would later withdraw from the Soviet Union in 1922. However, a new wave of dangers awaited.